Thank you. I want to thank the deans at Stevens for helping to host this, and to John in particular, both for organizing it and also for the really kind introduction. So I'm old enough that I remember the very first time I ever saw and then used a computer. My dad took me to a science center in North Carolina at the age of 7, where I learned how to program this amazing device to design a smiley face out of a series of letter M's. And then it printed out on one of those old spool printers with the perforated paper on the side of it. That was my first experience with computers. Now, since then, the centrality of computers to my life, but all our lives, it's almost impossible to fathom. For example, we live in a world where every year over 40 trillion emails are sent. The first web page was made in 1991. There's now more than 30 trillion individual web pages out there. Moreover, the internet's no longer about compiling and sharing information. It's also emerging to have an impact on the world beyond the online domain through the so-called Internet of Things. For example, Cisco estimates that over the next 5 years, there'll be more than 40 billion internet-enabled devices coming online. Everything from refrigerators to cars to thermostats. Google just paid a couple $2 billion for a smart thermostat business, to smart power grids, all linking together. What that means is that domains that range from communication to commerce to critical infrastructure to conflict, 98% of US military communications run over the civilian-owned and operated internet. All of these domains are increasingly cyber-dependent. We truly do live in a digital age. But with this relatively short history of computers and the networks that they're linked into, I think we've reached a turning point, or at least a defining point. Just as our dependence on this world is growing, the risk side is too. Now, you can see this in a lot of different ways. One would be the astounding numbers. For example, every single second, 9 new pieces of malware, software designed to cause computer harm, 9 new pieces are discovered every second. Let me repeat that, 9 every second. To 97% of Fortune 500 companies know that they've been hacked. The other 3% have been too, they just aren't willing to admit it to themselves. The military side, over 100 different nations have created some kind of cyber military command, a unit designed to fight and win wars in this space and beyond. Indeed, the very first Pew poll of 2014 took a survey of Americans about what they feared most, and it found that they feared cyber attacks more than Iranian nuclear weapons, North Korean nuclear weapons, the rise of China, authoritarian Russia, or climate change. So what this means is that these fears, they've coalesced into a booming industry, one of the fastest growing industries in the private sector across the world, but also on the government side, one of the fastest growing bureaucracies, whether you're talking about the national level, the state level, or the local level, constantly seeing growth in these cybersecurity bureaucracies. And so they also mean that for all the hope and promise of the digital age, we also have to admit that we're living through an era of what I would call cyber insecurity. And it's at this point of the talk that I try and do something a little bit counterintuitive, but maybe will help us make that point. A lot like the challenge, as was kindly introduced in before, of how do you write on a seemingly technical topic and make it accessible and interesting. You also have the same when you're giving a speech, and particularly what kind of visuals can you do when you're talking about a space of zeros and ones of software. So what I've done is put together what I believe is a fun little collection, but it helps make a point. It's my choices for the best and worst examples of cyberwar art. So it's going to play for you. And the point, I'm not going to speak directly. It's going to play behind me. And this is for a couple things. One, it's to visually drive home that story of cyber insecurity that's out there. Another is the fact that there have been studies that have found that people are 60% more likely to retain what you're saying in a speech if they're looking at something at the same time. It actually doesn't have to link what the person is saying. It's just one of those weird ways that our human brain works. And that actually connects back to a broader discussion in the book and in the talk that I'll give, is we need to recognize the human side of this and all the strange little foibles that we bring to this. So hopefully the technology will work with us and that we haven't been hacked in the interim. And all right, here we go. So to move on, let's pull back on all of this. Why a book about cybersecurity and cyber war, and why now? For me, it's best encapsulated by two quotes. The first is from President Obama, who declared that cybersecurity risks pose, quote, the most serious economic and national security challenges of the 21st century. The second quote is from the former CIA director, who said, quote, rarely has something been so important and so talked about with less and less clarity and less apparent understanding. So that cross between something that is incredibly important but less and less understanding, again, we can see it in all sorts of different ways and all sorts of different fields. For example, 70% of business executives, not 70% of CTOs or CSOs, but 70% of executives in general have made some kind of cybersecurity decision for their company, despite the fact that no major business management program teaches it as part of your normal responsibilities. That same gap happens at the schools we teach our journalists, our lawyers, our diplomats, even folks in the military. The book is also filled with all sorts of strange, funny, but in a certain way, kind of sad anecdotes that carry this gap home, particularly in the senior leadership. For example, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, the civilian agency in the US ostensibly in charge of cybersecurity, she talked to us about how she hadn't used email, in fact, hadn't used social media for over a decade, not because she didn't think it was secure, but because she just didn't think it was useful. Or the Supreme Court Justice who talked about how they hadn't yet gotten around to email. That was their quote, hadn't yet gotten around to it. They'll eventually. Now, again, in the upcoming year, they'll decide cases that relate to everything from net neutrality to the constitutionality of some of the NSA activities. But in their own world, they just haven't yet gotten around. This problem is not just an American problem. We saw the same thing in meetings with officials from China, Great Britain, France, UAE. For example, the lead civilian official, the equivalent of a cybersecurity czar in Australia, had never even heard of Tor, a critical technology in this space. Don't worry if you haven't either. As John said, maybe buy the book. But the point is you have this gap among people with great responsibility. And the result is that cybersecurity is an issue that is as crucial at a personal level to areas that you care about, from your bank account to your personal privacy, to it shaping the future of world politics itself. And in turn, issues in world politics are connecting back to the personal level when you look at questions of privacy, like we've seen in the Snowden NSA affair. But it's been treated as a domain only for what I jokingly call the IT crowd, the IT folks. The problem, the challenge, is that the technical community understands the workings of the hardware and the software, but it doesn't deal well with the wetware, the human side, all the ways that it ripples out beyond. And so it often looks at these issues through a very specific lens and often fails to appreciate some of the ripple effects into other worlds. So the dangers of this stovepiping, this disconnect, they're diverse. Each of us, in whatever role we play in life, again, whether in our professional role, in our business or our organization, or our role as citizens and what we think about political topics, to how to protect ourselves and our family online. We all make decisions, cybersecurity decisions, that shape both the future of the online world and us in it, but also the real world. But we often do so without proper tools, basic terms and essential concepts that define both what's possible, but even more so what's proper, what's right and wrong. They're being missed, or even worse, distorted. Past myth and future hype often weave together, obscuring what actually happened with where we are right now in reality.